Jeffrey was talking about the Facebook of then CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, which contained the top performers of the organization that need to keep them happy because they're so critical to achieve the most important goals of the organization. Over the last 2 months, I've had a chance to talk to over 100 software CEOs in 2 formats, and I learned something pretty surprising. Most of them also talked about having some sort of Facebook, which always included their top performing salesperson. What I thought was so interesting that several of them also then told me that in their Facebook, some of them had also the list of their top performing engineers who they need to keep happy. I love it because they know how important engineering is up there with the top performing people across the other parts of the organization. Because when you're a software company, software has to be a core competency. And we're now entering an age where every organization on the planet, software has to be a competency that they must create. And so I think this bodes really well for our profession. So, the next talk is something that we've never done before. We're calling it DevOps Confessions, Tales from the Trenches. And so for those of you who were here last year, you might have seen a pretty interesting, and for me, one of the most memorable moments of my professional career. It was a panel between Dr. Richard Cook, Dr. Steven Spear, who you'll be seeing tomorrow, and Dr. Sidney Dekker. So they are from the Lean and the safety culture community. And this was part of something that John Willis and I had been cooking up for a year. But during this panel, Dr. Richard Cook, who's at The Ohio State University, said something very interesting. He had some very specific advice for this community. He said, there are certain types of experience reports are great, but there are certain types of stories that you will not hear on stage. Instead, you can only hear them after the sessions, usually after a couple of drinks at the bar. And that's where the real lessons are told, because great practice comes from experience, and experience comes from bad practice. Great practice comes from experience. Experience comes from bad practice. So his advice was, we have to figure out how we can find those stories. And so a lot of us, we took that very seriously and tried to figure out a way to be able to collect those stories and find some way to share them. So inspired by an idea from Scott Nasello from Columbia Sportswear, I started interviewing people with the following promise. Is there a story that you'd love to share in an anonymized way? I'll write it up, and I would anonymize it, and then for all the people who contributed to the story, you would have an opportunity to modify it, conceal it to whatever degree you feel comfortable, and have final approval on whatever we come up with, and we'd share it at the conference. Personally, I have found these stories to be incredibly meaningful, and now I actually understand why they're so difficult to share on stage. So maybe to motivate that, I think the best way to prove that is by just going to the first story. So here is story 1 based on several interviews. And it goes something like this. Several years ago at my company, a position opened up that I really wanted. It would have been a promotion. I thought I had done everything right, including lining up all the support of all the other leaders who I thought were politically important and crucial. All of them thought that I would be perfect for the job, given my experience, skills, and my track record. I was crushed when not only did I not get the position, but the reasons they gave me seemed so off base. I texted this to my friend, and the text read, I was just told that I didn't get the job. They told me that I didn't qualify for these reasons: insufficient communication skills, insufficient strategy skills. They told me they wanted to invest in me. It seems like some pretty silly and shallow HR words designed just to make me feel better. That didn't work. Lol. Oh well, looking forward to seeing who my new boss will be. Closed doors always open up new ones. Smiley face. So here's what I was feeling when I wrote that. I felt like it was clearly time for me to start looking at new opportunities, despite having been at this company for many years. Clearly, my leadership did not recognize what I can do, and they're not giving me a chance to do what I know passionately what is right. Although I hate this feeling of leaving the company where I could be viewed as having failed at something. What would my peers think? What would my friends think? They probably would think that I left because I couldn't cut it, and that's why I jumped ship. The second feeling was that of being an imposter. In other words, maybe I'm not actually as good as I think I am. Maybe looking for another job will actually be an act of fraud. Would I be someone who is knowingly pretending to be better than I actually am? After all, if I was really that good, then I would have gotten that promotion, right? And those are the growing feelings of self-doubt that led me into a feeling of depression for many weeks. It was weeks after I found out that the news that I had texted my friend. They had some interesting advice to take. They had some interesting advice. One was take the company up on the offer to get a professional coach assigned to you. Talking to my friend, I got a totally different point of view and some other helpful suggestions. My friend also told me their own story of not being promoted. Actually, it was worse. My friend actually got demoted, like Jeffrey Snover. Then suddenly my situation didn't seem so bad. All kidding aside, it was extremely comforting to talk to someone who went through something similar and to get their perspectives. Looking at all these correspondences and text messages with my friend from all those years ago, several things jump out at me, given time. One, talking to this friend at that time gave me so much energy. Mentally, it shifted me from a dark place to one where I started thinking about how I can take advantage of this. Two, I learned over the next weeks and years that's how some of my behaviors were holding me back. I've always been a pretty humble person, and I'm always very cautious not to blow my own horn. But the feedback from my coach was that all the other leaders that she was interviewing said, I just learned for the first time what I did, and they were blown away. But their valid concern that they voiced to the coach was, how come I didn't know about this and all of this amazing work until now? So I learned that my humility and inability to blow my own horn was actually not just holding me back, but it was also holding my entire team back. I got some very specific advice about how to spread awareness of what my teams are doing and get that in front of every leader that actually mattered. I became a better communicator and more fearless about telling everyone what we were doing. And one of the outcomes was that we became known as experts in what we do and increasingly being asked to help on important things. And there's no better mark of success than being asked to help. Now I'm marketing what I'm doing throughout the entire company in a more deliberate way, knowing that it's not just good for my teams, but it's also good for the company. I also realized how important it is to have a support structure. All our journeys are full of ups and downs, and without the right help from friends in similar positions, I might not have gotten the help I needed. What I came to realize is that my teams also need the same sort of support structure. I started working on making sure that my people have the right tools to cope as they go through their own struggles. On a journey like we're on, they will surely be hitting bumps in the road just like I did. So where am I now as I write this confession? I learned that being passed over for promotion was just a setback, a temporary setback, and may actually be one of the best things that happened in my career. It forced me to learn things that I think are critically important to professional skills, which will help me for the rest of my career. In fact, I'm now teaching it to my own staff because it will help them in their own careers. At this point, I've never been more optimistic about my career at the company. I'm working on some of the most strategic programs in the organization. And maybe most of all, I've never had as much fun as I am having right now. People are having to compete for the ability to work with me and my teams. Not only am I doing everything that I want to do, I'm being supported by what feels like every level of leadership, and I'm being asked to take on more and more teams. And I know that I'm helping take the company forward, and that contribution is being widely recognized. And here's another thing I've learned. I used to think that you need a certain title to be influential, but I learned that this is absolutely not the case. So that concludes the first confession. And what's interesting to me is that when I read this to other people, to hear their own reflections. One person said, isn't it interesting that that person who didn't stick around and didn't persevere would never have known what they missed out on? In that other universe, they probably got a new job, but they wouldn't have learned something that they now view as critically important. I'll just pause there for a moment. Did anyone else find something useful in that story? Round of applause. So, actually, can everyone give a round of applause to the set of people who actually contributed to that story? Thank you so much for that. By the way, from my own perspective, I was cleaning out my own office a couple of years ago, and I ran into an email that I had printed out 10 years ago, where my CEO had written me saying, essentially, I wasn't contributing enough to the strategy at the strategy level, and I had gotten moved over. And I remember in that moment feeling a twinge of pain, and then I just laughed and threw it away. That was over a decade ago, and I think time showed that he was right. I've learned so much since then, and I could have been so much more effective in that role. But everything that I had learned there went into the Phoenix Project, right? And so I view that as a real gift. So, all right, let's go to story number 2. Before I go into the next story, let me first note that This story shows a whole other dimension of why certain stories can't be shared on a stage like this, attributed. and you'll see why. So a couple of years ago, something strange happened that made me realize I had to do whatever it takes to modernize the technology practices of my company. Trust me, software is absolutely critical to our organization, but you would never guess that by the way we treat developers. I was working on a major project that was at the center of a very important program, and everyone, including myself, were tracking the progress of this project because it was that important. However, one day, a bunch of us noticed that the daily updates from a certain group representing hundreds of developers just stopped showing up. A couple of days went by and no updates. Some of us were wondering whether it was due to perhaps a really bad power outage, an earthquake, or something like that. In this case, the work was being done by one of our offshore R&D groups. So I asked around to people I knew there, asking, does anyone know what's going on, and is there anything that I can do to help? I got back complete radio silence, which made me even more nervous. I kept calling everyone I knew in the organization when I finally learned from a developer who finally admitted that corporate security had confiscated all of their USB drives, which prevented hundreds of developers from doing their daily work. My next question was, of course, what happened that caused InfoSec to confiscate everyone's USB drives? And what I learned made me very sad. These teams have a lot of antiquated tools and can't run the same systems that we use in production. They don't have and for their workstations, they don't have administrative access. They can't get access to the command line. They can't use any development tools that were written in the last decade. And they can't use anything that haven't been approved by an all-powerful architecture review board who haven't done actually any coding probably in the last 15 years. Violating these rules can actually get you fired. So all of these things make it impossible for developers to be productive. And don't get me started on the version control tools they use. One day, a developer found a backdoor in their workstation that they could apply to give them admin rights, which allowed them to install software that would actually help them get their work done, that would make them a lot more productive. And this developer wanted to help their fellow developers. Seeing other developers struggle, this person would say, hey, run this because it will help you do your job. Corporate security finally detected when they noticed certain executable files were being modified. They started tracing back where it came from, and it all led to this one developer, and they freak out because now they're worried that all their customers might be infected by a virus. And so the back doors were closed, and all of the USB drives were confiscated. And no one can get their work done without those USB drives. Development managers were complaining. They were ignored by corporate security. They had opened up a ticket, but the security officer was on vacation for a couple more days. It bothered me that they couldn't escalate this. It was like having a bunch of carpenters on the payroll, but not allowing them to use hammers. I went ballistic and went to all my leadership and convinced them finally that we had to get those USB drives to those developers. After days of negotiation, we finally ended up with this crazy compromise. We agreed that they could use USB drives, but only those that were verified to be virus-free. They had to be sealed in a plastic container and hand-couriered by plane in a duffel bag. To me, it felt like an episode of Breaking Bad. Seeing a friend hop onto a transoceanic flight with a duffel bag full of nearly 1,000 USB drives, and I imagined what this person would say when he goes through the metal detectors, or what he has to say to the customs official. My lesson, there is no cavalry coming to the rescue to rescue these teams who need help. If we don't help them, these developers are doomed to suffer, and my leadership has shown that they don't actually care, and quite frankly, this is why sometimes I don't trust corporate IT. I always ask for budget to do everything myself because they have let me down every time I needed them. I've gotten in more trouble with my management for putting too many things on my corporate credit card. But each time, I've taught myself to challenge them by saying, if you think I'm doing the wrong thing, fire me. In fact, you have a responsibility to fire me. And I say that sometimes because I'm afraid, because I'm not sure if my family is actually knows that I might be fired that day. But I do have a reputation of getting things done. And here's the thing that really bothers me, though. I think I'm doing what's best for my organization, and I know I can be sometimes abrasive, and sometimes I've been known to shout in meetings, but I'm now just becoming aware that I'm getting a reputation of living in an ivory tower. And because I talk about principles a lot, I've been told, you're just being a purist. When I object to something, now people roll their eyes and say, oh, you must have just read another book. You don't understand how real people actually get work done. Frankly, this makes me pretty upset. I'm in the trenches working every day with developers. Unlike these people are so distant from the work that they can't even appreciate the damage of what they did to hundreds of developers. And this is why sometimes I get tired. And right now I'm learning how to communicate in a way that doesn't trigger the ivory tower response. So that is confession number 2. This person goes on to say, I think the way we handled offshoring in this, I've seen it work well, and I've seen it work terribly, and I think this is actually one of the worst decisions ever made by this company. So, all right. So that concludes the second confession. I hope you found these to be interesting and instructive, and incidentally, if you have your own story to share that you think might be useful, feel free to send me a DM on Slack, and I will get back to you. Not today, but in the weeks to come. Thank you. So that concludes the morning programming. The next time we will convene here is at 4:55 when the afternoon keynotes will resume. So see you then. Thank you very much.